Okay, we are go.
Okay. Estimated Ambassador and Representative, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for participating in and sponsoring this event that we have been organizing every year on the anniversary of the start of the popular movement that called for freedom and a political transition toward democracy. This event has become a legacy that many Syrians are waiting to hear from you, confirmation of your support for their basic rights. This is necessary for us to continue the struggle and not lose hope in light of prolonged Syrian catastrophe, the failure of the political transition, and the continuing perpetration of violations by all parties to the conflict, primarily the Syrian regime and Russia. This event will not have been possible without the intensive cooperation and coordination with our partner, the DRL. Thank you to Anna and Sofia for their great effort over the past weeks. Lastly, I would like to thank the International Commission of Inquiry, Madaniya organization, the Civil Defense for accepting to participating with us. Also, thank you, Mary, for moderating the session. I pass it on the floor to you.
Thank you very much, Fadel. It's an honor to moderate such an important event. Thank you everyone for joining us today and welcome to this event. It will be held both in English and in Arabic, so don't forget to use the translation tool at the bottom of the screen. Today we will discuss the ongoing human rights violations and abuses that Syrians continue to face 12 years into the conflict, and we will explore how the international community can advance justice and accountability efforts to hold those responsible for violations and abuses accountable. So to discuss these key issues, we have 9 distinguished participants that I will introduce. We have Erin Barclay, the Acting Assistant Secretary for Democracy, Human Rights and Labor from the USA. We have Ethan Goldrich, the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Near Eastern Affairs from the USA. With us, we also have Dr. Mohammed bin Abdulaziz Al-Khulaifi, the Assistant Foreign Minister for Regional Affairs from Qatar. We also have the Special Envoy for Syria from the Netherlands, Mr. Gijs Gerlag, and his counterpart from Germany, the Special Envoy for Syria from Germany, Mr. Stefan Schneck. And we also have with us, or will have soon, Sawsan Abou Zainedin, the CEO of the organization Madaniya, as well as Linnea Arvidsson, who will represent the Commission of Inquiry for Syria. And we'll also join Mr. Raed Saleh, the director of the Syrian Civil Defense that you might most know from the name White Helmets. And last but not least, who introduced the event, Fadel Abdul Ghany, the executive director of the Syrian Network for New Human Rights. So thank you to all of you to participate in this event. And without further ado, I will give the floor to Erin Barclay.
Thanks so much, Marie. Good morning and good afternoon, everyone. It's a real honor to be here. Let me start by thanking Germany, the Netherlands, Qatar, and the Syrian Network for Human Rights for co-hosting this event with us today. And I really appreciate representatives from the UN Commission of Inquiry for Syria, as well as Syrian civil society for offering your expertise on this important panel. As we know, today marks the 12th anniversary of the start of the regime's violent suppression of peaceful protests in Syria. Despite egregious abuses and violations over the ensuing years, Syrian human rights defenders continue to bravely demand their human rights. To put it simply, we have stood with you since 2011, and we will continue to stand with you. Violations and abuses affect every Syrian family. Some of the atrocities committed by the regime amount to war crimes and crimes against humanity. 12 years on, the Assad regime continues its brutality with ongoing reports of arbitrary detentions, torture, killing of political opponents, activists, human rights defenders, journalists, and medical professionals. Reports also detail how widespread enforced disappearance is deliberately perpetrated by the government security forces on a massive scale, spreading fear, stifling dissent, and punishing perceived political opponents. Despite a decrease in fighting compared to previous years of the conflict, Syrians continue to face horrific human rights abuses and violations at the hands of the Assad regime and other parties in the conflict. Though we may see less coverage of these abuses in the media, let me be very clear. Those suffering them are not forgotten. We grieve with the people of Syria who have faced even further tragedies through last month's earthquakes. The US government is focused on helping address the immediate humanitarian needs following these devastating earthquakes. At the same time, we remain committed to supporting Syrian civil society and to addressing the human rights violations and abuses the Syrian people have faced since long before the earthquake struck. The United States will not cease our support for the Syrian people and will continue promoting respect for the dignity and human rights of all Syrians. This includes providing support to Syrian civil society, pursuing accountability through their documentation of atrocities, assisting victims, and seeking to determine the status, fate, and whereabouts of detainees and missing persons. The US supports the creation of a new UN entity to address missing persons as called for by the UN Secretary General. And we are working with a number of partners to secure the creation of this missing persons mechanism in the UN General Assembly. We will also continue to support UN resolutions that condemn abuses and violations committed in Syria, including this month in Geneva at the UN Human Rights Council, as we work to renew the Commission of Inquiry's mandate. We will continue our unwavering support in coordination with allies and partners to hold the regime accountable, along with its enablers, Russia and Iran, and any others who violate or abuse human rights in Syria. Impunity is simply unacceptable. Just last week, Secretary of State Blinken announced the US designation of Amjad Youssef, the Syrian military official who killed at least 41 unarmed civilians in the Tataman massacre, for his involvement in gross human rights violations. Today is an important opportunity to take stock of our collective efforts to respond to the ongoing human rights violations and abuses that Syrians continue to face 12 years into this conflict. As we do so, we must explore how the international community can do better at advancing justice and accountability efforts to hold responsible those who have blood on their hands. Finally, I'd like to thank members of Syrian civil society for sharing with us the challenges you, your families, your colleagues, and your fellow Syrians continue to face. I would be remiss not to acknowledge the emotional and mental toll that comes with repeatedly discussing traumatic experiences. And I applaud your bravery in sharing information with us and others. We recognize this and we are grateful for your willingness to share with us. I want to assure you, we are listening. Thank you. Back to you, Marie.
Thank you, Erin, and thank you for reminding the strong commitment and support from the US. I will now turn to your colleague, Mr. Ethan Goldrich.
Good morning, good afternoon, everybody. I would like to thank the Syrian Network for Human Rights for co-hosting today's event on human rights abuses and violations in Syria, a subject with which we are unfortunately all too familiar. I would also like to thank the speakers that have joined us today. I'm honored to be here with you and to reaffirm the United States' commitment to working with you and the Syrian people to achieve justice and accountability in Syria. Today marks the 12th anniversary of the Syrian conflict, 12 long years of human tragedy on an unimaginable scale. Bombardments, chemical weapons attacks, enforced disappearances, torture, arbitrary detention, forced displacement, the COVID-19 pandemic, cholera, and now earthquakes are just a fraction of the many tragedies the Syrian people have had to endure. This year, the Syrian people experienced earthquakes that since February 6th have claimed the lives of nearly 6,000 Syrians inside the country and nearly 4,000 more across the border in Turkey, many of whom had arrived there after fleeing the Assad regime's brutality. I want to extend the United States' heartfelt condolences to all those affected as a result of the earthquakes. Many of those joining us today lost loved ones, friends, and colleagues. Over the course of the last few weeks, we have heard their pleas for assistance. We have seen the videos of first responders like the white helmets, once again, rushing to the scene to deliver life-saving aid. We have heard the stories of Syrians donating the little they have to help fellow Syrians in need. Okay. We firmly believe that stability in Syria can only be achieved through a political process that represents the will of all Syrians. That process must include justice and accountability, which are essential to securing a just and enduring peace. The United States has contributed to these efforts at the UN by condemning and calling on actors to end abuses, violations, and atrocities, by sanctioning regime officials and other actors for their abuses and violations, by supporting the UN Commission of Inquiry, the IIIM, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, and civil society organizations, documenting and investigating these violations, abuses, and atrocities, and by providing psychosocial support to survivors and their families. We support the prosecution in third countries of those responsible for atrocity crimes in Syria, which we've seen in France, Germany, and Sweden under the principle of universal jurisdiction. And we have made progress toward being able to prosecute these crimes in the United States. In January, President Biden signed the Justice for Victims of War Crimes Act, which enables the prosecution of war criminals in the United States, regardless of the offender's or victim's nationality. Today, as we commemorate the 12th anniversary of this horrendous war, and we confront abuses and conflicts elsewhere, we must show the Syrian people that we have not and will not forget their plight. We are determined to do all we can do to help the people of Syria. Since news of the earthquakes broke, we have prioritized getting help to those in need. Thus far, the United States has announced $185 million in assistance for earthquake relief efforts in Turkey and Syria. As we remember those suffering from the impact of the earthquakes, we gather today to shed light on the ongoing abuses and violations in Syria, many committed at the hands of the Assad regime. For well over a decade, the Syrian people's demands for freedom, political reform, and respect for human rights have been met with repression, human rights violations, or abuses and atrocities. There cannot be impunity for the individuals who ordered and carried out these transgressions. Syrian civil society organizations have played a leading role in crisis response and support following mass atrocities. They have shown us, as one organization put it, that localization matters. We applaud and commend their efforts to serve their fellow Syrians. This includes the White Helmets, a longtime partner of the United States, carrying out the heroic work of saving lives and documenting abuses and violations in the conflict. We're honored today to be joined by the founder of the White Helmets, Raed Saleh, and would like to thank him and the hundreds of volunteers who every day embody the White Helmets motto, to save a life is to save all of humanity. I'm going to repeat a section that I think I've already read that got out of order in the speech, but I think it's important to put it back into order. We firmly believe that stability in Syria can only be achieved through a political process that represents the will of all Syrians. That process must include justice and accountability, which are essential to securing a just and enduring peace. The United States has contributed to these efforts at the UN by condemning and calling on actors to end abuses, violations, and atrocities, by sanctioning regime officials and other actors for their abuses and violations, and by supporting the UNCOI, the IIIM, the Organization for the Prohibition of Chemical Weapons, and civil society organizations documenting and investigating violations, abuses, and atrocities, and by providing psychosocial support to survivors and their families. And we support prosecutions in third countries of those responsible for atrocity crimes in Syria, which we've seen in France, Germany, and Sweden under the principle of universal jurisdiction, and have made progress toward being able to prosecute crimes in the United States, with President Biden signing the Justice for Victims of War Crimes Act. Together, our efforts can serve as a reminder of the meaningful ways we can advance accountability, and despite persisting challenges, including the obstacles created by the regime's allies at the UN. We will not cease these efforts. Criminal justice processes are one component of the quest to promote accountability, countering impunity, sanctioning human rights violators and abusers, documenting, preserving, and analyzing evidence, accounting for the thousands of missing and unjustly detained persons in Syria, and supporting survivors are other steps that must be taken in parallel. Advancing all of these efforts can help ensure that we are responding to the broad array of needs of the Syrian people. We are committed to working closely with all of you to do so. We will also continue to engage our allies, partners, and the international community to advance the political process and to seek a durable political solution that is grounded in justice and accountability. We know we cannot reach a durable peace without justice for the abuses and violations of these past 12 years. We have not forgotten the war crimes that the Assad regime committed against the Syrian people, and we will do all we can to press other governments not to forget them either. And so again, we reaffirm that the United States will not normalize relations with the Assad regime or lift sanctions on Syria until there is authentic and enduring progress toward a political solution for the conflict. The regime and its Russian and Iranian enablers must immediately halt their ruthless attacks on the Syrian people. Enough is enough. I look forward to hearing the testimonies of those who have dedicated their lives to documenting and highlighting the violations, abuses, and atrocities that have taken place in Syria. Events such as today's gathering serve as an important reminder to us all that the international community must act. Therefore, let us continue to do the work necessary to achieve a better future for the Syrian people. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ethan, and thank you for paying a tribute to the role of the Syrian civil society. We are looking forward to hearing more from them later on in this event. But before that, I will invite Dr. Mohammed bin Abdulaziz Al-Khulaifi to give his remark.
Thank you, Mary. Thank you very much. Good morning and good afternoon. At the outset, I would like to express my appreciation to the organizers of this important event, whom we share with our deep concerns on the situation of human rights in Syria for the last 12 years. I also would like to thank my dear colleagues, Erin and Ethan, for their valuable remarks. 12 years ago, the Syrian people courageously and peacefully took to the streets to demand freedom, justice, dignity, and equality, of which are their basic legitimate rights. Unfortunately, they were met with unprecedented violence, leading to what we have been observing for the last 12 years, resulting in millions displaced refugees over the globe, thousands detained, tortured, and killed, and cities and towns completely wiped out. Sadly, the miseries were aggravated by the recent earthquakes that hit Turkey and Syria, on which the state of Qatar acted steadfast by establishing an air bridge to provide humanitarian and medical assistance, along with the ground rescue personnel to alleviate the suffering of the people affected by this disaster. The state of Qatar expresses its full support for the international efforts aimed at holding the regime accountable for its horrific crimes against brotherly Syrian people, and ensuring that war criminals in Syria are brought to international justice. Qatar supported the United Nations Human Rights Council in establishing the Independent International Commission for Inquiry on the Syria Arab Republic. Moreover, the state of Qatar is a main sponsor of the international, impartial, and independent mechanism to assist in the investigation and prosecution of persons responsible for the most serious crimes under international law committed in Syria since March 2011. And throughout our continuous supports and mechanism, we hope that they will continue to pursue for comprehensive justice for the Syrian people and for all those affected by the serious crimes committed by the regime. The state of Qatar acts proactively and engages with every efforts towards resolving the crisis, and with all our international partners and the UN, the state of Qatar holds its firm position that the only solution to this crisis is through a political solution between all the Syrian parties in accordance with Geneva Communique 1 and Security Council Resolution 2254, in a way to preserve the unity and sovereignty of Syria and to fulfill the aspiration of the people for, or its people, for security and stability. We will continue to support all efforts to help and assist our Syrian brothers and sisters and ensure that their basic legitimate rights remain as a priority for the international community until such rights are fulfilled in a just and dignified way. We urge all international partners to continue their support and double their efforts in the humanitarian and political, as the overall environment faces complexities that does not serve those who are suffering from this crisis. I thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Assistant Foreign Minister, and thank you for insisting on the efforts towards justice and the fulfillment of the rights of the Syrian people. I will now give the floor to Stefan Schneck.
Thank you, Mary, and thank you to the SNHR and all partners who are present today. It's a very sad occasion, of course, but it is very important. It's a legacy, as Fadel said it, and I would like to echo on what Erin said. It's against forgetting, against the risk that it might be a forgotten conflict. It is not in Germany. I would like to underline that. And let me start with a remark on the political implication which we have, and later on accountability. We all agree that I think in this room here that the dire situation once more shows that the urgent need to work towards a political solution in line with the UNSC Resolution 2254. Very important, and we therefore support the UN Special Envoy Pedersen and his efforts to energize the stalled political process. And we call on the regime, of course, and the Russian side to stop blocking any progress in this regard. This is the key. It is clearly, in this regard, not the time to rehabilitate Assad without any meaningful progress in the political process. This is why, let me state that, we will continue to pursue our 3-no policy towards Assad, which is no normalization, no reconstruction that benefits the regime, and no lifting of sanctions. On accountability, the sad truth is that 12 years into the conflict, not a single perpetrator of the horrible crimes has been brought to justice at international level, despite all the evidence which is currently at our disposal. Yet, there is a reason for a certain confidence in the absence of international justice. As was already mentioned, national jurisdictions have started to fill the gaps. Former officials of the Syrian regime's repression apparatus members of Daesh and other terrorist groups are standing before courts or have already been sentenced. And you know, as it has been the case in Germany, where in the small provincial town of Koblenz, the first final verdict was taken and became a symbol for the effectiveness and reality of world law and universal jurisdictions. Prosecutors in Germany and elsewhere continue to bring new cases to courts. So yes, universal jurisdiction can be an effective and proportionate tool for pursuing accountability for the most serious crimes under international law. However, given the sheer scope of human rights violations in Syria, we must continue to press for all tangible ways to hold perpetrators accountable. And therefore, documentation is really important, and we continue to support all efforts, those of already mentioned international impartial and independent mechanism for Syria, or those of the Commission of Inquiry, those of the civil society organizations, and relatives of the victims, to ensure that those responsible for torture, killing, and all other atrocities in Syria will ultimately face justice. It is high time. And let me also underline that we strongly support the implementation of the new UN mechanism on missing persons. It is in our view imperative that the mechanism is set up swiftly as an independent international entity to support the search for the missing and families of survivors. It is a glimmer of hope for Syrian families looking for their missing relatives. Thank you.
Thank you, Stefan. I will now give the floor to Gijs Gerlag.
Yes, thanks, Marie, and thanks, Fadel, and the Syrian Network for this opportunity. And good day to you all. Last week, the Netherlands hosted the Women Advisory Board to the Office of the UN Special Envoy Pedersen in our support towards a political solution. And besides realizing the vital role Syrian women have and should play in resolving the bitter conflicts, having time for profound conversations with these brave women, when listening to their personal stories of loss and their human rights violations in their own families, and of the women, girls, and men and boys in their communities, then only the true impact of the violence of the past 12 years really hits home. It's quite unimaginable to fully grasp what the Syrian people have had to endure for so long now, and really to comprehend the extent of their suffering. An extra worrying thought I took away last week is that the solidarity between people in Syria trying to make the best of it seems to be diminishing rapidly, especially in the earthquake-affected regions. Reports of increased sexual and gender-based violence in general, but in the overcrowded collective shelters specifically, with vulnerable groups like elderly women and unaccompanied children at peril, are deeply worrying. On top of that, this week, the research of the Commission of Inquiry, the report of last Monday, is still talking of continued aerial attacks, the use of cluster bombs, patterns of crimes against humanity, and deaths in government forces operated detention facilities, including due to torture. The report states victims being discouraged to report sexual violence, with some threatened with murder by their families for honor-related reasons, or forced to marry the perpetrator instead. Arbitrary detentions and fear-mongering are no less, and the list continues. Given those crimes, we know we have to persevere in our efforts to try and improve their situation. For the Netherlands, this means, next to our continued humanitarian support, that the fight against impunity is key. That is why we, joined by Canada, have invoked Syria's responsibilities for human rights violations under international law, specifically holding Syria responsible for torture under the UN Convention Against Torture. And all our efforts to obtain justice for Syria need to have one thing in common: to reflect the will and voices of the victims and survivors. Justice in isolation from those who have been harmed and wronged will lose its meaning, because anything about them, without them, can never be truly for them. Together with countries, of which some are in this meeting, that feel the same urgency, we have proposed new listings as well of people who are continuing violations and who are systematically denying the most basic rights to the Syrian people. Especially when we are seeing a trend of normalization towards the regime, we think it's important to keep the pressure on. It's crucial. And we have all to work in unison while relying on each other and on institutions such as the IIIM. The work of IIIM is crucial in supporting accountability efforts at the national, regional, and international level. And when multilateral efforts have not yet led to the desired result, we need to look at our national toolboxes as well. For instance, the Netherlands, we arrested in January a suspected security chief of Daesh. So for all those Syrians affected by the atrocity of the past 12 years, accountability is long overdue. We encourage everyone to remain committed and to seek justice for those who suffered and continue to suffer. Thank you.
Thank you, Gijs, and thank you everyone for your presentations. I think it is very good and reassuring to hear, even as we enter the 12th year of the conflict, that all of you remain strongly committed to finding a political solution, to accountability. I will now open the panel for question and answers. And I will start with Linnea Arvidsson from the Commission of Inquiry for Syria. Linnea, can you please tell us, as we enter the 12th year of the conflict, what types of abuses are Syrians facing currently? And can you please also tell us the specific abuses affecting IDPs and refugees in the current context?
Thank you, Marie. Can you hear me okay? Excellent. No, thank you for that question, and thanks to all for these very sobering speeches, and thank you so much for inviting us to this event. On your question, we launched our latest report only on Monday this week. It's our 43rd since the Syrian crisis started 12 years ago, and I wanted to briefly introduce a little bit of the findings that we've made in that very recent report, which covers the last 6 months of last year. This report was drafted just before the earthquakes, actually. But what is quite striking, and one thing that shouldn't really be forgotten, is that precisely the areas that were affected by the earthquake a few weeks later were the ones where we saw dozens of attacks, which still killed and injured hundreds of civilians and damaged civilian infrastructure in the months leading up to the earthquake. And according to our investigations, these attacks entailed violations of international humanitarian law, possibly war crimes by different actors. We investigated 20 ground and aerial attacks carried out by pro-government forces in Idlib and parts of Western Aleppo. There was, you may have seen, a single indiscriminate cluster munition attack on densely populated displacement camps by the Syrian government forces, which injured or killed 67 civilians in November, and an unguided rocket attack hitting a market in Al-Bab, injuring or killing 45 civilians. We also saw Russian airspace forces continuing their pattern of carrying out unlawful strikes, 4 which we investigated in northwest Syria during that period. Daesh also launched at least one direct attack against civilians that we looked at in Daraa, and there were also several unlawful attacks on IDP camps near Afrin and the civilian commercial area in Isas, which were launched from Tel Rifat, where we know that both pro-government forces and Kurdish armed groups were present at the time. And we also saw an attack impacting the grounds of a new church in Hama. So all this to say that war crimes continue in Syria, even though they've fallen off a little bit the front pages recently. In government-controlled areas, the violations that we've seen that are related to detention facilities continued. The patterns of crimes against humanity and deaths in these facilities continued, including due to torture, ill treatment, or lack of access to medical care. And protracted incommunicado detention and enforced disappearances by government forces remains pervasive in these areas. And what's quite striking is that in the context of a very severely deteriorated economic situation, we can see that arbitrary detention practices, which are aimed at extorting money from relatives of detainees flourished. And there was also continuing insecurity in Daraa, Sweda, and Hama, where we also saw clashes between government forces and armed groups, targeted killings, which has been a pattern for a long time, and also deaths and injuries during anti-government protests. Then if we look at the situation in the nearly third of the country, which remains beyond the government's control, in Idlib, we saw that Hayat Tahrir al-Sham members continued arbitrary detention, incommunicado detention, and enforced disappearances. Also, there are multiple credible reports of executions of detainees by firing squad, including women, which are currently under investigation, and a continued repression of fundamental freedoms and targeting of media workers, for instance. In the north, the Syrian National Army brigades and military police also continued with similar detention-related violations, where torture was documented in several facilities, also leading to the death of detainees. And detention-related violations remains a huge challenge also in the northeast, where we know that the Kurdish-led Syrian Democratic Forces continue to detain more than 10,000 suspected Daesh fighters and other men and boys allegedly affiliated with the group across the northeast in quite terrible conditions, with scores dying of tuberculosis during last year. And their families remain, of course, interned in Al-Hol and Rosh camps, where conditions continue to deteriorate for the 56,000 mainly women and children held there. And the Commission has found that the suffering inflicted on them may amount to the war crime of committing outrages on personal dignity, given the length also that this situation has been going on. The Commission joins the calls of many of you present here, calling for repatriation to the 66 countries who have nationals in the camps. And this needs to speed up. But going to your final questions, Marie, about returns, this is something that we have looked at particularly. And while we could see over the past 6 months that Syrian authorities have publicly encouraged returns in various international fora, in practice, they have failed to provide Syrian refugees, migrant workers, and displaced persons outside government-controlled areas who want to return with information about how to do so, how to receive reliable clearance to return, and when such clearances are denied, how they can appeal such decisions. And the Commission, for the first time, documented several cases of Syrians who were denied return in violation of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, or who were arrested upon their return despite having received a clearance to return prior to doing so. We also keep documenting that IDPs are prevented from accessing their residential property upon return, which obviously entail violations of housing, land, and property rights, and confiscation of property of IDPs and refugees is rife also in the areas held by the Syrian National Army further up north also. And I know we don't have a lot of time. I just also wanted to mention, Gijs, you mentioned SGBV. This is also something we briefly report on in the report, and it's very concerning because it's perceived to have increased. And despite the fact that underreporting is significant, we know that victims have been discouraged to report sexual violence. Some are threatened with murder by their families for honor-related reasons, or forced to marry the perpetrator instead. And there is a problem there with current Syrian legislation. We know that laws making adultery punishable may mean that victims of rape risk being subjected to criminal investigation themselves. And Syrian legislation which grants mitigated sentences to rapists who agree to marry the victim, as well as regarding marital rape and domestic violence, remain in violation of the Convention Against Torture and CEDAW. I will stop there, but that's the picture that you will get from our latest report. And perhaps just finally, I really wanted to echo what Stefan said about the upcoming chance later this month for member states in New York to consider creating a mechanism with an international mandate to coordinate and consolidate claims regarding missing persons and including persons subjected to enforced disappearance, which is such an important opportunity to do something for Syrian families who have waited way too long for action. And we're very hopeful that this will lead to action later this month, potentially. Thank you so much. And over to you, Marie. Thank you.
Thank you, Linnea. Thank you for this sobering account, and thank you for also ending on a more positive note. I will now turn to Sawsan Abu Zainedin from Madaniya. I would like to talk about an important issue, which is housing, land and property rights. Linnea, you mentioned violations of property rights. Sawsan, can you tell us, please, how do the regime legislation and the practices of armed opposition groups impact the housing, land and property rights of Syrians, including those arbitrarily detained and those forcibly disappeared?
Sure, thanks, Marie, and thanks for everyone for organizing the event. What I would like to highlight is that the politicization of the housing, land and property rights file in Syria actually predates the conflict, but has been significantly weaponized following the uprising in 2011 and used as a tool of repression and as means to enforce military, political and economic interests of the regime. The HLP file is not a file handled by technical local offices in Syria. It's a file in which security branches are heavily and directly involved. It has been used to arrest people and forcibly disappear them. It has been used to ensure the permanent displacement of certain populations and to block the movement of others. The way the regime is dealing with this file largely overlooks the fact that half of the country is displaced and millions live in non-regime held areas and hundreds of thousands are detained, and that all of these populations have no means to claim their property rights simply because of the securitized nature of this file. I'll be highlighting some of the technical details to show the complexity, particularly in the way destruction in the country has been implemented. This is to say that destruction in Syria, and it's large, reports talk about at least a third of Syria's housing stock being destroyed due to the conflict. What needs to be highlighted in here is that this is not the collateral damage of the conflict. The destruction of Syria has been largely studied, and it's claimed to be that its nature, its patterns, and the distribution of it suggests that it was employed by the Syrian government as a strategy to target opposition communities and to force their surrender. It specifically targeted residential areas and key civilian facilities, including the hospitals, schools, and bakeries, to cut vital supplies and to force people to surrender. Now, in addition to the destruction that was induced by military actions, there have been multiple waves of demolitions undertaken by the Ministry of Defense and other regime institutions using bulldozers and dynamites, razing entire neighborhoods to the ground, particularly in areas claimed to be associated with the uprising. We have seen this as early as in 2012, but we've seen it later after 2018 in multiple areas that have been recaptured militarily by the government. Destruction and demolition are seen to be linked to a multi-phase strategy aimed at clearing central urban land in preparation for urban development projects that are currently slowly under development, and that would have a far-reaching impact as they hold significant violations to the displaced people's housing, land and property rights, threatening their right to return in the short, medium and long terms. Those urban development projects can best be described as discriminatory, politically loaded gentrification projects used to punish opponents while rewarding crony capitalists and investors linked to the government. Now, in addition to the strategies of destruction linked to strategies of reconstruction, we need to highlight the masses of laws, housing, land and property rights laws that were issued by the government. There are over 150 HLP laws issued only post-2011. To name a few of these controversial laws, there's the counterterrorism law, which embraces the government's broad interpretation of what constitutes terrorism, criminalizing a large segment of the displaced population in the process. But we also have how this applied to the assets of the hundreds of thousands of detainees and enforced disappeared people and to their families by associations, because according to the interpretation of the government, these would be defined as terrorists. This has also impacted large numbers of human rights defenders and charity workers in Syria because of the same definition. Another example is the military conscription law, which provides for seizing the properties of military evaders who fail to pay exemption fees. And again, this has automatically targeted hundreds of thousands of young men in Syria and their families by associations simply because they refuse to join the government armed forces. Now, challenges to the HLP file also include secondary occupation, and this is a practice we've been systematically practiced not just by the regime, but by other de facto authorities and armed groups in the different regions in Syria. We've seen the illegal confiscation and subsequent allocation of properties in the different regions, mostly driven by political, military, or economic interests. And this sometimes included alteration of original HLP documents or the manufacturing of fraudulent ones. I want to highlight that on top of all of this, the earthquake has only exacerbated the complexity related to the housing, land, and property rights file. That's in relation to the destruction, but also the politicization of damage assessment and aid provided through the regime now, with the regime having a track record of aid diversion over the past decade. But equally, the earthquake has resulted in surging normalization trends in the region that are very worrying on so many levels, including in relation to the HLP files in Syria. And that's basically because incentives for such normalization from the regime will most probably come in the form of investments in the property markets that would allow further exploitation of human rights and HLP rights. And we know this for sure because we have seen the regime paying huge military debts in the form of property investment to Iran and to Russia. We appreciate the commitment shared today to support a political transition in Syria that's necessary for justice and accountability in all files, including the HLP one. But we genuinely hope that we can count on collaboration with you to implement tangible policies and strategies that would implement a political transition in Syria beyond the stalemated political process. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Sawsan, for highlighting these very, very important issues that are sometimes less discussed. Time is running out, so I will turn to Raed Saleh from the White Helmets. Raed, that's an honor to have you in our panel. You might have not heard it at the beginning, but a tribute was paid to the work of your organization. I would like to ask you about the response to the earthquake. How can we respond to the emergency need of the earthquake victims while at the same time not losing sight of the longer standing human rights situation?
يعني أكيد بداية شكرا لكم للاستضافة، وأنا بعتذر عن التأخير، ولكن بسبب أنه أنا كنت في إدلب المديني وعم بنتقل لمكان تاني، لمكان اللي بدي أحضر فيه المؤتمر، صار معي تأخر على الطريق بسبب يعني أمر طارئ، فأعتذر عن الموضوع وكان مفترض انضم لكم من البداية. وشكرا لكل الزملاء اللي تحدثوا من قبل، وشكرا لفضل يعني على هاي الدعوة أكيد العظيمة. لا شك أنه تعزيز حقوق الإنسان هو أمر مهم جدا مع الذكرى 12. أنا مثل ما كنت عم بحكي، مثل ما خاطبت الناس السوريين اللي كانوا متجمعين اليوم بمدينة إدلب وقلت لهم صمودكم لمدة 12 سنة، من حقكم أن تحصلوا على حقوقكم، من حق الضحايا يحصلوا على حقهم بعد 12 سنة من الانتهاكات المستمرة. ولا شك عملية الزلزال هو ممكن فاقمت الناس، والتعامل مع الزلزال بعد اليوم. هلا نحن بدأنا بعملية المرحلة بإزالة الأنقاض المباني، أيضا الوضع إطار قانوني واضح للتعامل مع هاي الأنقاض، التأكد من ملكية المباني، ما يكون المباني مسيطرة عليها من قبل جهات عسكرية أو جهات أخرى، نتأكد، نحن عم نحاول نتأكد من كل مبنى إنه صاحبه موجود وقت رفع الأنقاض، حتى نضمن إنه إذا طلع في أمانات أو أنواع موجودة تحت الأنقاض يتم تسليمها بشكل آمن وسليم لأصحابها. أيضا عم نحاول نتأكد إنه نتعامل مع هاي الأنقاض ويتم إعادة تدويرها لاستخدامها بشكل صح، إما بأرضيات للمخيمات المؤقتة أو بأرضيات للمشافي الميدانية، حتى ما يكون في إلى أثر سلبي على البيئة على المدى البعيد. عملية التعامل أيضا بكرة مع عمليات التعويض الناس أو إعادة الأعمار ما تضرر من الزلزال، أيضا هي بحاجة لآلية قانونية حتى ما يتم ارتكاب أخطاء أو انتهاكات بحق المالكين الحقيقيين لهدول المباني اللي تدمرت. فعليا نحن هلا عم نستجيب مثل ما قلت لإزالة الأنقاض، حطينا خطة قانونية لحتى نضمن إنه ما يكون في عنا انتهاكات ارتكبت. عم نتعامل أيضا مع المجالس المحلية مع المنظمات الأخرى لحتى فعليا نضمن كل الحقوق لأصحابها. وما بعد هي رح نبدأ بعملية إعادة تأهيل البنية التحتية والمرافق العامة مثل المدارس. لازم نضمن الأطفال يرجعوا على المدرسة بسرعة، لذلك حاليا عم يتم عملية تقييم المدارس. عم نشتغل أيضا على المستشفيات، على الطرقات، على الصرف الصحي، لأنه مثل ما تعرف أصلا المنطقة عم بتعاني كان من الكوليرا قبل الزلزال، فأيضا في خوف من انتشار الأوبئة بسبب انتشار المخيمات المؤقتة واللي هي لسه ما فيها بنية تحتية. فكمان أيضا عم نحاول نعمل عمليات كشف سريع للبنية التحتية لإعادة تأهيلها. فكل هاي الأمور بصراحة هي تحديات عم تواجه فرقنا على الأرض، ونحن عم نحاول نتعامل مع كل هاي التحديات بظل الظروف الصعبة اللي صارت، بظل الأخطاء اللي ارتكبت بالاستجابة الأولية من قبل الأمم المتحدة. ولذلك نحن نتشكر شركائنا الدوليين اللي دعمونا، نتشكر أكيد يعني قطر وألمانيا وأمريكا وبريطانيا والدنمارك وفرنسا والشعوب الشعب السوري بكل مكان، والشعوب العالم اللي ساندتنا ودعمتنا فعليا لحتى نستمر بأعمالنا. كل هاي الأمور بصراحة بنحاول نتعامل معها، وأكيد نشكر كل اللي دعمونا واللي وقفوا جنبنا بهاي المحنة الصعبة. ونحن عم نحاول بكل قوتنا بكل إصرارنا أنه نتجاوز هاي الأزمة ونسعى وندعم عمليات التعافي السريعة من الزلزال، ونساعد المدنيين ليستعيدوا حياتهم بشكل طبيعي أكثر. شكرا جزيلا للجميع.
شكرا راهد. I will turn now to Fadel. Fadel, little time is left, but can you please tell us first what are the tools available to hold the Syrian regime and its backers accountable for human rights violations and violations of international law? And can you also please tell us how to increase pressure on countries, individuals and companies that support the rehabilitation of the Syrian regime in order to advance accountability?
Thank you, Marie. Normalization is against accountability. Normalization means the success of the Syrian regime with impunity, because the Syrian regime is still committing crimes against humanity, as confirmed by the latest report from the Commission of Inquiry. Since the first report in November 2011 and until the last, the Commission of Inquiry confirmed that the Syrian regime has committed crimes against humanity. Severing political and economic relation and imposing sanction on the Syrian regime is because of the atrocities violation it has been committed. And this is what is stipulated in international law. As a common article of the Geneva Convention stipulated that the state must respect the convention and ensure respect. So the assurance of the respect also responsibility by the state by imposing sanction, condemnation violation, protecting civilians. The UN did not impose any form of sanction on the Syrian regime, neither economic nor military. And over the years, this has sent the wrong message to the Syrian people, because the Syrian regime was not deterred by the UN or by the rest of the world. It was encouraged to committed violations on the large scale. We must warn countries, companies, and individuals that normalization relation with the Syrian regime, we must warn them that this act constitutes support for the Syrian regime. Therefore, according to the international law, this makes them contributor to the violation committed by the Syrian regime against its people. Accountability must reach to the supporter of the Syrian regime, not only the Syrian regime. Russia and Iran, because of their support, the Syrian regime could reject the political transition with impunity, knowing international sanctions were imposed on Russia due to its practice in Syria, similar those imposed on Russia because of its illegal intervention in Ukraine. This encouraged Russia to commit hundreds of war crimes in Syria, including helping the Syrian regime use chemical weapons of mass destruction. As the recent report of the RBCW, the IIT team, proved Russia's involvement in Douma chemical attack. We hope that sanctions will be imposed on Russia and Iran because of their support for the regime implicated in crimes against humanity. There are many mechanisms within the framework of accountability, such as the process of documenting violation, exposing, naming, and shaming the perpetrator, the criminal, using universal jurisdiction, and imposing more penalties on individuals involved in those crimes from all parties to the conflict. Still, all current available mechanisms cannot achieve real accountability without a political transition. We hope that will soon be achieved and that national court will lead the transitional justice process. I believe that the political transition is the strongest form of accountability that the Syrian regime and the rest of the conflict parties will be exposed to. All parties to the conflict, primarily the Syrian regime, and the greatest perpetrator. Why we always focus on the Syrian regime? Because based on the Syrian Network for Human Rights database, the regime committed approximately 85% from the total violations, and the remaining of the conflict parties only 15%. This actually, those violations from the Syrian regime and the parties caused millions of victims, all waiting accountability. We have no choice but continue documenting the violation of the Syrian regime and the rest of the parties, condemning them, pressurizing its allies to abandon it, and stressing that as long as the current Syrian regime remains in governance, there will be no stability or accountability. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Fadel. And sorry, we're running out of time to take questions from the audience, unfortunately. But I would like to thank all the participants for the very important and insightful presentations. And Fadel, I will let you conclude the event.
Sure, thank you. I will echo you, Mary, of thanking, and I'm glad that we hear this obligation from the state toward assuring their position toward supporting the Syrian rights in this anniversary. That's what the Syrians want to hear. So thank you very much, and hope to see you soon. Thank you. All the best.